All the characters and events in this story are a figment of fantasy. If something suddenly seems familiar, it's just a coincidence. Don't judge too harshly. Every author was once a beginner, and your support means a lot to me. In the comments, tell us from which city you are enjoying this audio version. Share your thoughts or personal story, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next incredibly exciting story that will definitely surprise you. Love is forever, until Friday comes. The morning at the Carter house began like hundreds of others. The sun lazily filtered through the floral-patterned curtains, bathing the kitchen in soft light. Liz Carter stood at the stove, stirring oatmeal in an old saucepan. The smell of cinnamon hung in the air, mixing with the aroma of coffee brewing in the coffee machine. Her movements were precise, almost automatic, but there was no warmth in them. She looked like she was performing a duty rather than preparing breakfast for the family. It was 6:40 a.m., and the Chicago suburbs were just waking up. "Sophie, are you messing around again?" Liz shouted without turning around. There was irritation in her voice, but it was muffled, familiar. "The bus will leave without you." A muffled answer came from above, from her daughter's room. "Mom, I'm almost ready, just. Where's my sweater?" Liz shook her head, but her lips twitched into a slight smile. Sophie, their 16-year-old daughter, has always been a little chaotic. Her energy, her habit of speaking faster than she could think, sometimes reminded Liz of a version of herself that was long gone. She glanced at the empty chair where Jack, her husband, usually sat. He was already gone. He had left for work before she even got up. As always. The door to the kitchen creaked and Jack entered. His dark blue jacket was slightly wrinkled, and his face was as impenetrable as a concrete wall. He looked as if he was already mentally at the construction site, even though the morning had barely begun. "Is the coffee ready?" he asked, looking somewhere past Liz. His voice was smooth, almost mechanical. "On the table," she answered, without looking up from the stove. Her fingers gripped the spoon a little tighter than necessary. "I thought you left again without saying goodbye." Jack froze, as if trying to remember if this was true. Then he shrugged. "I didn't want to wake you," he said, taking the thermos. "You went to bed late." Liz snorted but remained silent. She could remind him that she was waiting for him last night while he was sorting out papers in his office. She could tell that he promised to watch a movie with her. But instead, she simply stirred the oatmeal with more force than necessary and turned to the sink. Jack hesitated, as if he wanted to add something, but instead muttered, "See you," and left. The door slammed, leaving Liz in the silence of the kitchen. She looked at the bubbles bursting on the surface of the porridge and felt something heavy settle in her chest. Sophie came down 10 minutes later, her dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail and her backpack slung over one shoulder. She plopped down on a chair and reached for a box of cereal, pointedly ignoring the oatmeal. "Mom, are you serious? This mess again?" She wrinkled her nose. "It smells like an old sofa." "This porridge is healthy," Liz snapped, placing the bowl in front of her daughter. But her tone was more familiar than stern. She sat down opposite him with a mug of coffee, cupping it in her palms. "And put your phone away while you eat." Sophie rolled her eyes, but put her smartphone down. Her gaze slid to her father's empty chair. "Did Dad fly off to work like a rocket again?" she asked, scooping up some cereal. "He has a project," Liz answered, looking into her mug. "You know how it happens." "Yeah, I know. He is always on some project." Sophie jabbed her spoon into the bowl. "Do you even chat with him sometimes? Or am I now your personal translator?" Liz looked up, caught off guard. Sophie looked at her with that teenage directness that always made her feel vulnerable. She wanted to brush it off, say something light, but the words stuck. "We're talking," she finally squeezed out, but her voice sounded unconvincing. "Just adult things, Sophie." "Never mind." Sophie snorted and went back to her cereal. But her eyes scanned the kitchen, the faded wallpaper, the stack of bills on the corner of the table, Jack's lonely mug forgotten by the sink. She wasn't naive. She saw her parents grow distant, even if they didn't admit it themselves. Jack drove down the highway, clutching the steering wheel of his old pickup truck. The radio was turned off. He preferred silence to collect his thoughts before the workday. But today, the silence seemed heavier. He thought about Liz, about the way she had looked at him this morning with that mixture of fatigue and reproach that he did not know how to unravel. He wasn't good at such things. His father, a strict engineer from Iowa, taught him that men solve problems, not talk about feelings. And Jack followed this rule all his life. But with Liz it didn't work. He turned into the parking lot of a construction company, where life was already in full swing. The contractors were arguing about supplies, and the chief engineer was waving at him, demanding an urgent meeting. Jack took a deep breath and got out of the car. Work was his comfort zone. Everything was clear here: drawings, calculations, solutions. Not like at home, where every conversation with Liz was like walking on thin ice. At the office, he was immediately sucked into a whirlpool of tasks. The new bridge across the river required revision of the drawings, and Jack plunged into the numbers as if into a life preserver. But somewhere at the edge of his consciousness, he still saw Liz's face, her eyes, which once burned, but now seemed extinguished. Liz walked Sophie to the door, handing her lunch in a paper bag. "Don't forget about the chemistry test," she reminded me. "Mom, I'm not a child." Sophie rolled her eyes, but smiled. "Good luck with your advertising business." Liz watched as the yellow school bus drove away, carrying Sophie around the corner. Then she returned to the kitchen and froze. The silence of the house was almost tangible, like cold air. She turned on the radio to drown her out, but even the cheerful voice of the DJ did not help. Liz opened her laptop to check her email, but her eyes caught a frame on the shelf, a photo from their wedding. She is in a white dress. Jack is in an unusually strict suit. Both laugh as if the whole world belongs to them. Liz looked away. She needed to prepare a presentation for tomorrow's meeting, but instead she went into the living room and sat on the couch, staring into space. Her fingers nervously fiddled with the edge of her sleeve. She was a marketer, and her work once inspired her. She came up with campaigns that made people smile, buy, dream. But now it all came down to deadlines and endless edits from clients, and it was no better at home. Jack, Sophie, bills, laundry, all this was her life, but for some reason she felt like an outsider in it. Sophie was sitting in literature class, but her thoughts were far from Shakespeare. She thought about her parents. Last night she saw her mother sitting in the living room with a glass of wine, and her father silently leafing through some documents in the office. They weren't even in the same room. Sophie knew that marriages weren't always perfect. She'd heard friends complain about their parents. But her mom and dad, they were different, weren't they? She remembered her mom telling her how her dad once surprised her by taking her to Lake Michigan just for the sunset. Where is it all now? By the end of the lesson, she had an idea. Maybe they need to be reminded how to be together. Dinner, candles, music. She knew that Mom loved Italian food, and Dad always hummed to old Rolling Stones songs. If she can give them a night like old times, maybe they'll look at each other the way they did in that photo again. "Hey, Sophie, where are you?" Her friend Emma poked her with her elbow as they walked down the corridor. "I'm thinking about Mom and Dad," Sophie admitted, adjusting her backpack. "It's like, I don't know, they forgot how to be a couple." Emma chuckled. "Well, give them a date. Order some food, light some candles, and stay with me for the night. My folks do that sometimes, like romance." She giggled. Sophie smiled. It was a good idea. Simple, but maybe exactly what you need. By late afternoon, Liz was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through her work notes. Jack had not returned yet, although it was almost 7. She sent him a message. "Are you coming soon?" The answer came 20 minutes later. "I'm delayed. Soon." As always, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat back in her chair. She was 40, but she felt older. Somewhere inside, she was still Liz, who danced in the rain while Jack looked at her with a smile. But Liz disappeared, dissolving into routine. She looked at her watch. Another day was coming to an end, and nothing had changed. When Jack finally walked in, she didn't even look up. "Dinner is in the refrigerator," she said. without looking up from her laptop. "Thank you," he replied, throwing his jacket over the back of the chair. He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something else, but instead went to the kitchen. Liz took another sip of wine and closed her eyes. Tomorrow will be a new day. Maybe he will be different, or maybe he will be the same. Sophie sat on the windowsill in her room, legs crossed, scrolling through her phone. Outside, the Chicago suburbs were bathed in the gray light of late October, and some indie band she found last week was playing in her headphones. The room was her little chaotic world. A garland with dim light bulbs hung over the bed, pencils, and an unfinished biology note were lying on the table, and in the corner there was a guitar that she never learned to play. But now Sophie was not thinking about music or school. Her thoughts revolved around her parents. The morning left a bitter aftertaste. Mom looked like every movement was a burden to her, and Dad. Dad was like a shadow that passed through the house without leaving a trace. Sophie was not an expert in family matters. She didn't even know how to respond to a message from Tim from the chemistry club, who suddenly began to write to her more often. But she knew for sure that her parents were drowning in something from which they themselves would not be able to get out. And if they weren't going to save themselves, it looked like she was going to have to do it. She opened a chat with Emma, her best friend, and typed, "Hey, do you think if you give your parents a romantic evening, they'll stop being like zombies? Like dinner, candles, whatever." Emma responded a minute later, adding a bunch of emojis. "Ha, are you a matchmaker now? Really, order them food, leave the house, and let them sort it out. I told you, my ancestors do this when they want to rekindle the spark. Just don't expect them to start dancing under the moon." Sophie chuckled, but the idea had already lit up in her head like a light bulb. She knew that her mother loved Trattoria Bella, a small Italian restaurant in the city center. Liz always ordered tagliatelle with shrimp and a glass of Pinot Grigio there, and Dad took lasagna and muttered that they never skimp on the cheese. Sophie remembered how they came back from this restaurant one day, laughing at how her mother spilled sauce on her dress. It was one of those memories that she held in her heart as proof that her parents could still be happy. She opened the restaurant's website and started filling her cart. Tagliatelle for Mom, lasagna for Dad, tiramisu for both of them. Mom always shared dessert, even if she pretended she didn't want it. Delivery for tomorrow, Friday, 7 p.m. Sophie figured that if she left for Emma by 6, her parents would be alone. Maybe they can finally talk without her. Not about bills, not about school, but about something real. She paid for the order with her mother's card, the one Liz gave her for emergencies. Sophie decided that saving the family was quite an emergency. When she finished, she leaned back on her pillow and felt a little like a spy planning a secret mission. "Sophie, are you alive there?" Liz's voice came from behind the door. "Yet everything's fine," Sophie shouted, quickly closing the site. She jumped off the windowsill and opened the door. Liz stood in the hallway holding a basket of laundry. Her face was tired, but she still looked beautiful, with those dark curls falling out of her bun and the freckles Sophie had always wanted to inherit. "Have you done your homework?" Liz asked, narrowing her eyes. "Or are you on the phone again?" "Mom, I'll manage everything." Sophie rolled her eyes, but smiled. "Listen, will you and Dad be home tomorrow evening?" Liz frowned, clearly not expecting such a question. "Maybe." "And what? Are you going to see Emma again?" "Maybe," Sophie shrugged, trying to look indifferent. "Just clarifying." Liz looked at her with slight suspicion, but just nodded. "Okay, clarify. But if you leave, let me know in advance." She turned around and went downstairs, and Sophie breathed a sigh of relief. The first step is taken. The next day at school, Sophie caught Emma in the cafeteria. The smell of French fries and pizza filled the air, and the tables buzzed with conversation. Emma sat in the corner, munching on an apple and flipping through a fashion magazine she had stolen from her older sister. "Well, Cupid, how is your plan going?" she asked without looking up. "Food has been ordered." Sophie plopped down next to him, opening a bottle of water. "Now we need candles. And make sure that they don't run away to their corners. Dad is always at work, and Mom is stuck on the laptop." Emma giggled. Candles are already serious. Where will you get it? In the supermarket? Or do you have a secret stash of romantic items? Haha, very funny, Sophie poked her in the shoulder. I'll go to Walgreens after school. Will you help me, or will you just laugh? I'll help. Emma raised her hands as if giving up. You can spend the night with me if you want. Mom will make her signature tacos, and we'll watch some dumb rom-com. But if your ancestors start showing mercy, I want to know everything. Ugh, Emma, they are my parents. Sophie wrinkled her nose, but laughed. I just want them to. Well, remember that they are a couple. They used to be cool, you know. Mom told me how Dad sang to her under the window when they were just dating. Sang, my dad, who won't say too much now. Emma looked at her with a slight smile. That's nice, Soph. Really, if it works, you'll be, like, the hero of the family. Or a complete fool if they start arguing, Sophie muttered, but her eyes were burning. She could already imagine her parents sitting at the table, laughing, holding hands. It was naive, but she couldn't stop believing. After school, Sophie went to the Walgreens on the corner. The store smelled of cleaning products and microwave popcorn that someone had been heating up in the back room. She made her way to the household goods department and found a shelf with candles. There were some expensive designer jars and cheap bags of tea lights. Sophie chose a set of 3-pillar candles: vanilla, sandalwood, and something called Winter Forest. She sniffed each one, trying to guess what her parents might like, and decided that vanilla sounded quite romantic. At the checkout, a guy her age, with acne and a Kyle name tag, looked at the candles with a slight grin. Party? He asked, punching the goods. Something like that, Sophie smiled awkwardly. For parents. Wow, Kyle raised his eyebrows. What, are you arranging a date for them? Yeah, Sophie shrugged, feeling her cheeks burn. They deserve it. Kyle chuckled, but didn't say anything, just handed her the package. Sophie walked outside, clutching the candles to her chest. The cold wind ruffled her hair, but she felt warm inside. She was doing something important, maybe even right. At home, Sophie hid the candles in the living room closet, behind a stack of old magazines. She checked the order the restaurant sent a confirmation. Everything was in place. Now we had to figure out how to convince our parents to stay at home. Dad could stay late at work, and Mom sometimes stayed late with clients. Sophie decided that a note was the best option. Something short so they don't suspect a trick, but warm enough to make them want to stay. She sat down at the kitchen table with a notepad and pen. After crossing out a few lines, she wrote, Mom, Dad, I'm at Emma's for the night. Dinner is on the table. Just relax and be together. You're awesome. You just need to remember this. Sophie. She reread it and decided it was normal. Not too sweet, but with a hint. She folded the note and put it in her pocket to leave it on the table tomorrow. That evening at dinner, Sophie watched her parents, trying to guess what mood they were in. Liz sat with a glass of wine, scrolling through something on her phone, and Jack silently ate the casserole that his mother had prepared. The silence at the table was almost palpable. Dad, will you be late tomorrow? Sophie asked, trying to sound casual. Jack looked up, clearly surprised. Don't know. Maybe I'll be late. And what? Just like that, Sophie shrugged. I thought maybe you and your mom would watch a movie or something. Liz looked at her over her glass. Why are you so curious all of a sudden? Well, sometimes you watch stuff. Sophie jabbed her fork into the potatoes. It would be cool if you, well, spent time together. Jack and Liz looked at each other, but said nothing. Liz just chuckled, and Jack went back to his plate. Sophie sighed. Her plan should work. He simply must. The next day, Sophie was on pins and needles. She double-checked her order, hid the candles in the kitchen, and found an old playlist of songs her mom loved: a little Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles. By 5 o'clock, she had packed her backpack and left a note on the kitchen table next to the fruit bowl. Before leaving, she walked into the living room, where Liz was sitting with her laptop, frowning at some presentation. Mom, I'm going to see Emma, Sophie said. I'll be back tomorrow. Okay, Liz didn't look up. Call me if anything happens. Sophie hesitated. Mom, stay with Dad alone, okay? Just stay. Liz looked at her in surprise, but Sophie had already run out the door. She walked towards Emma's house, feeling her heart pounding. Her plan was ready. Now everything depends on the parents. Jack Carter pushed open the front door, shrugging his dusty jacket off his shoulders. The smell of vanilla and something sweet hit his nose, making him freeze on the threshold. The living room, usually lit by the cold light of a lamp, today shimmered with soft gold. 3 candles were burning on the kitchen table, their lights flickering, casting shadows on the walls. Boxes with the Trattoria Bella logo stood nearby, and the muffled tune of Fleetwood Mac came from an old record player in the corner. Jack frowned. It was unexpected. Liz, he called, throwing the keys on the nightstand. His voice sounded louder than he expected in the silence of the house. Liz emerged from the kitchen holding a glass of wine. Her dark hair was loose and her dress was simple, but the same blue one that she wore when she wanted to look not like her mother. She looked at Jack and her eyebrows raised slightly. "You're early," she said, and there was more surprise than warmth in her tone. "Usually you're at a construction site until 9. Jack shrugged, feeling out of place. "Finished the drawings. I thought I'd be back early." He nodded towards the table. "What kind of production is this?" Liz put her glass down and crossed her arms. "Ask your daughter. This is her idea. A note, food, candles. She's staying with Emma for the night, and apparently we should." She hesitated, searching for a word. "Have fun." Jack walked over to the table and opened the box of lasagna. The smell of cheese and tomato sauce was familiar, almost comforting. He noticed a note lying next to a bowl of fruit and took it. Sophie's handwriting was uneven but neat. "Mom, Dad, I'm at Emma's for the night. Dinner is on the table, just relax and be together. You're awesome, you just need to remember this, Sophie." He reread the last line and felt a pang in his chest. Sophie saw more than he thought. Jack put the note down and looked at Liz, who was already opening the second box of tagliatelle. "She tried," he said quietly, not knowing what else to add. Liz chuckled, but her lips twitched into a weak smile. "Yes, our little director. Okay, sit down. Let's not throw away food." They sat down at the table, and the first minutes passed in silence, interrupted only by the clinking of forks and quiet music. The candles burned evenly, but their light could not melt the awkwardness that hung in the air. Jack looked at his lasagna, trying to figure out where to start. He wasn't good at talking, he never had been. His father taught that words are spent on action, not on feelings. But now, looking at Liz, who was twirling the glass in her hands, he felt that he had to say something. "Delicious," he finally squeezed out, nodding at the food, just like before. Liz looked up, and something flashed in her gaze, either surprise or irritation. "Yeah, like before," she repeated, and her voice was a little harsher than necessary. "When we went to Trattoria and could say more than 2 words in an evening." Jack tensed. He knew that tone, the one that came when Liz was ready to argue. He put down his fork and tried to change the subject. "Work was a mess today," he said, hoping that neutral ground would be safer. "The contractors screwed up the deliveries again. I had to count all the concrete." Liz looked at him over her glass. "Seriously, Jack? Sophie gave us this performance, and you want to talk about concrete?" He opened his mouth, but the words stuck. She was right, but he didn't know how to fix it. Instead of answering, he picked up his glass of water and took a sip, hoping that the silence would sort everything out. Liz finished her wine and reached for the bottle. Her movements were sharp, almost defiant. "You know," she said, pouring herself another, "I thought that at least today you would try. For Sophie's sake, if not for my sake." "Trying what?" Jack frowned, feeling irritation boiling in his chest. "I'm here, eating dinner, listening to music. What else do you need? It's not about the food. The point is that you sit here as if at a meeting and are silent. It's like you don't care." "I care," he snapped, and his voice became firmer. "I'm trying, Liz. I always try. For you, for Sophie. But you never have enough." Liz froze, her fingers clenching her glass until her knuckles turned white. She looked at him, and there was so much pain in her eyes that Jack felt his anger dissolve. But he didn't know how to fix it. He never knew. "Maybe I really don't have enough," she said quietly, looking away. "Maybe I'm tired of being the one who always procrastinates." She finished the wine in one gulp and stood up. "I'm going to bed," she said, without looking at him. "Good night." Jack watched her leave and felt something heavy settling in his chest. He wanted to call out to her, to say something that would bring her back to the table, but the words did not come. Instead, he remained sitting, looking at the dying candles. The lasagna had cooled down, but the tiramisu remained untouched. Liz went up to the bedroom and closed the door. She leaned against the wall, feeling the wine make her head spin. Her heart was pounding, and not just from the alcohol. She wanted to scream, cry, throw something at the wall all at once. But instead, she simply threw off her dress and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. She thought about Sophie, about her note, about her hope. Liz knew that her daughter saw more than she said, and that made it even worse. She wanted to be that mom, that wife who holds everything together, but today she felt empty. Jack was nearby, but his silence was louder than any words. She closed her eyes, hoping sleep would dull the pain. Sophie returned home in the morning around 10. She pushed the door open, expecting to see something different. Maybe parents are drinking coffee and laughing. Maybe an empty tiramisu box. But instead, she found the kitchen almost exactly as she had left it. Sophie froze, feeling her hope crumble. She walked into the living room and heard footsteps upstairs. Her mother must have already gotten up. Dad most likely went to work. She sat down on the sofa and stared at the record player. "Damn," she muttered, rubbing her temples. She tried so hard. She thought food, candles, music would all work, like in the movies. But her parents weren't rom-com characters. They were themselves. Liz came down a few minutes later, wearing an old sweater and her hair pulled back into a messy bun. She looked tired, but tried to smile. "Hello, honey," she said, approaching Sophie. "How is Emma?" "Norm," Sophie shrugged, without looking at her. "How was your evening?" Liz hesitated, her fingers nervously fiddling with her sleeve. "It was nice," she finally said, but her voice was unconvincing. "Thank you for arranging it. It was unexpected." Sophie looked at her, searching her face for any hint of truth. But Liz looked away, and Sophie realized that the evening was not a success. She wanted to ask what went wrong, but instead she simply nodded. "Okay," she said, standing up. "I'm going to my room." Liz wanted to say something, but Sophie was already walking up the stairs. Closing the door, Sophie threw herself on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She felt stupid, but somewhere deep down there was still a spark. This was just the first step. She won't give up. Her parents were worth the fight. Liz Carter sat in her office, staring at her laptop screen. A table with data on a new advertising campaign was shining on the monitor, but her eyes skimmed over the numbers without catching the meaning. Outside, downtown Chicago was buzzing. Cars honked, and the wind from Lake Michigan blew dry leaves along the sidewalks. The office smelled of coffee and fresh paper, but Liz felt as if the air around her had thickened, pressing on her shoulders. "Last evening the candles," Sophie's note. "Jack's silence was still spinning in my head like a broken record." She leaned back in her chair and rubbed her temples. Her desk was littered with reminder stickers, printouts, and empty latte cups. She used to love this job, coming up with slogans that caught on, campaigns that made people smile. Now it all came down to edits from clients and endless calls. Like her marriage, work became a draining routine. The door to her office opened slightly, and Caitlin Morris appeared in the doorway. "Kate," as she demanded to be called. Her bright red hair was styled in loose waves, and her fuchsia lipstick stood out even against her green dress. Kate was Liz's colleague in the marketing department, but their friendship, if you could call it that, rested on her ability to fill silence and on the fact that Liz sometimes gave in to her energy. "Hey, advertising star, are you alive?" Kate plopped down on the chair opposite, crossing her legs. In her hands was a huge glass with something pink and bubbly. You look like you've been run over by a truck. Liz smiled weakly, pushing her laptop away. Thanks for the compliment. It's just a long week. A week? Kate squinted, sipping her drink through a straw. You've been walking around like a ghost for a month now. What happened? Are clients losing their minds again? Liz shrugged, not wanting to go into detail. But Kate is not one to give up easily. She leaned closer, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Come on, Lizzie, spit it out. You know, I'm like a free therapist, only with cocktails instead of a couch. Liz sighed, feeling the words rushing out despite her resistance. Kate was not the kind of person with whom you should share personal things. She loved gossip as much as her bright outfits. But it was too hard for Liz to keep everything to herself. This is not work, she finally said, looking at her hands. This is, at home, Jack, all. Kate raised her eyebrows, clearly intrigued. Wow, family drama. Tell me, has he forgotten your anniversary again? If only, Liz smiled bitterly. He's just there, but he's not there. Yesterday, Sophie gave us dinner, food, candles, everything like in the movies. And he sat, as if at a meeting, and talked about his construction project. I tried, Kate. I really tried. But he didn't even notice. Kate put the glass down and leaned even closer. Her voice became softer, but her usual frivolity was still felt in it. Listen, Liz, men are like that. My second ex was the same way. He came home like I was furniture. Have you tried shaking it? You know, wear something sexy, make a scene, whatever. Liz shook her head, feeling her cheeks heat up. I don't want scandals. I just want him to see me, just like before. But he's not even trying, Kate, and I'm tired of being the one who always delays. Kate leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a smile that was both sympathetic and sly. Oh, honey, you're stuck in this family routine, like a fly in syrup. You need to shake yourself up. Remind yourself that you are not only a mother and wife, but also a damn cool woman. Liz rolled her eyes, but the corners of her lips twitched. Kate always knew how to sound convincing, even if her ideas were crazy. And how do you think I should shake myself up, buy a new sofa, start running in the morning? Well, for starters, Kate paused dramatically, come with me to New York next week. Business trip, presentation for those nerds from Bright Star. And after work, there's a bar, cocktails, and dancing. No kids, no husbands, just you and some fun. Liz frowned. A business trip to New York was planned, but she planned to spend the evenings at the hotel with a laptop and a glass of wine. Kate's idea sounded like something from another life, one where she was a 20-year-old student, not a 40-year-old wife and mother. Kate, I'm not sure, she began, but Kate interrupted with a wave of her hand. Don't start, Lizzie. You're not an old lady. One evening, a couple of cocktails, and you will remember how it feels to feel alive. And Jack might finally notice that his wife doesn't just cook him dinner. Liz looked at her, feeling doubt and temptation fighting inside her. Kate was frivolous. Her second divorce was the latest office gossip, and her party stories sounded like bad comedy scripts. But there was something in her words that hurt Liz. She was really tired of being invisible, tired of the routine, of Jack's silence, of the fact that her life has become a set of responsibilities. I'll think about it, she finally said, looking away. Think, but not for long, Kate winked, standing up. I'm making a reservation at the bar, so get your best dress ready. And Liz, she stopped at the door. You deserve to have fun. Is it true? Liz nodded, but her smile was forced. When Kate left, she looked at the screen again, but her thoughts were already elsewhere. New York, bar, fun. It sounded alien, almost scary. But somewhere deep in her soul, she felt a tiny pang of excitement, as if someone had opened a window in a stuffy room. The rest of the day passed in a bustle. Calls, edits, arguments with the designer, who again screwed up the color palette. Liz was on autopilot, but Kate's words kept popping into her head. By lunchtime, she found herself opening the website of the hotel in New York where she and Kate were to stay. There was a bar next to the hotel with a neon sign and reviews of the best margaritas in town. Liz closed the tab, feeling stupid, but her heart was beating a little faster. When she returned home, Sophie was in her room and Jack had not yet arrived. Liz cooked dinner, chicken and rice, nothing special, and sat at the table, scrolling through her phone. She wrote to Jack, "When will you be there?" The answer came half an hour later. Soon, delayed. As always, Sophie went down to the kitchen, holding her chemistry textbook. "Mom, you're kind of thoughtful today," she said, sitting down at the table. "Everything is fine." Liz forced herself to smile. "It's okay, honey. Just work. How are you doing?" "Norm," Sophie shrugged, but her gaze was attentive. "Listen, did it change anything? Well, between you and Dad?" Liz froze, not expecting the question. She wanted to lie, say that everything was wonderful, but Sophie looked at her as if she saw right through her. "That was nice," she finally said, looking away. "Thank you for arranging it. But, grown-up matters, Sophie. It's not always simple." Sophie nodded, but her face darkened. She buried her face in her textbook, and Liz felt a pang of guilt. She wanted to be better for Sophie, for herself. Maybe Kate is right. Maybe she really needs to change something. Later, after Sophie had gone to bed, Liz was sitting in the living room with a glass of wine. Jack returned around 9, threw his jacket on a chair, and silently walked into the kitchen. Liz listened to him rattle the plates and felt her resolve strengthen. She didn't want to be the one waiting anymore. I didn't want to dissolve in this silence. She opened her laptop and texted Kate, "I'm in. New York bar, everything like you said. Just no nonsense, okay?" Kate responded almost immediately, "This is my girl. I promise it's stupid, but only funny. Get ready, Lizzie. We're going to have a blast." Liz closed her laptop and looked at her empty glass. Her heart was pounding from fear, from anticipation, from something she couldn't name. She didn't know what awaited her in New York, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was taking a step forward, even if this step was into the unknown. Jack Carter stood at the edge of the construction site, squinting as the morning sun reflected off the steel beams. The air smelled of dust, metal, and fresh concrete. The noise of the excavators and the shouts of the workers merged into a familiar hum, which for Jack was almost soothing. Here, on this site, where a new bridge was being built across the river, everything was clear. Drawings, calculations, deadlines. No omissions, no glances that he didn't know how to decipher. But even here, amid the clanging and chaos, his thoughts kept returning to Liz. He clutched the drawing tablet in his hands, trying to concentrate. Last evening candles, dinner, Sophie's note still hung in my head like an unfinished report. Liz went to bed without saying a word, and he remained sitting at the table, looking at the cold lasagna. He knew he had failed her. He knew that she expected something more from him than talking about work. But what exactly, Jack wasn't sure he knew how to give it. Carter, Bill, the main contractor, shouted as he made his way through piles of rebar. His face was red from the heat and irritation. "Have you seen these specifications? They screwed up the supports again. If we don't fix it, the whole structure is to hell." Jack took a deep breath and nodded, switching to work mode. "Show me," he said, taking the folder with documents from Bill. His fingers quickly flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the numbers. The mistake was obvious. The supplier sent beams with incorrect parameters. This meant a delay of at least a week, if not more. "Damn," Jack muttered, rubbing his forehead. "We need to call them and recalculate the loads so as not to take risks." Bill snorted. "It's easy to say. They will drag their feet as always, and the customer is already breathing down my neck." "I'll figure it out," Jack snapped, his voice as hard as concrete under his feet. He didn't like empty arguments. Problems need to be solved, not discussed. He walked to his pickup truck to grab his laptop and paused for a second, looking at the river. The water glistened under the sun, reminding him of the summer when he and Liz first started dating. They went to Lake Michigan, and Liz danced barefoot in the sand as the sun set. She laughed so loudly that the seagulls flew up, and he looked at her and thought that he had never seen anything more beautiful. Then he felt alive. Now, Now he didn't know how to return that light to her eyes. Jack shook his head, pushing away the memories. It was a long time ago. Life has changed. They had Sophie, a house, and a job. He did everything he could to keep it together. But why then did every evening with Liz seem like a challenge? In the office at the construction site, a cramped trailer with peeling paint Jack telephoned the supplier. The conversation was long and tense. The manager on the other end of the line apologized, but was stalling for time, promising to figure it out by tomorrow. Jack clenched his teeth, his fingers drumming on the table. "I need a solution today," he said, trying to keep his voice level. "If you don't deliver the correct beams by Monday, we lose a week. And that's on you." The manager muttered something about logistics, but Jack already knew that he would have to go to the warehouse himself. He hung up and opened the drawings, recalculating the loads. His mind worked clearly, like a mechanism, but somewhere on the edge of his consciousness Liz was still looming, her offended look, her words that he doesn't care. He remembered his father, a strict engineer from Iowa, saying, "A man doesn't complain, a man does." Jack grew up in a home where feelings were not discussed. His mother was silent when his father was late at work, and his father never asked what was on her mind. Jack thought it was normal. But with Liz it didn't work. She was different, bright, open, alive. And he knew he was losing her, but he didn't know how to stop it. By lunchtime, the problem with the beans began to be resolved. Jack arranged for an urgent delivery, but this meant that he would have to check the materials in the warehouse himself tomorrow. He wrote it down in his notebook and looked at his watch. Noon. If he finished early, maybe he could get home before Liz went into her work mode with her laptop. He thought about flowers. Liz loved daisies, simple but bright, just like herself. Maybe if he brings a bouquet, that will be a start. Not with conversations, which he was afraid of, but with something tangible. He decided to stop at the flower shop on the way back. It wasn't his style, but for Liz's sake he could try. After lunch, the construction site erupted into chaos again. One of the cranes was stuck due to a hydraulic failure, and workers stood idle until a mechanic arrived. Jack ran between the trailer and the platform, giving instructions and checking reports. His phone was ringing with calls, customers, contractors, suppliers. By 3 o'clock, he was exhausted, but held on to coffee and stubbornness. "Carter, are you a robot or what?" Bill said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You don't even blink." "Just doing work," Jack replied, without looking up from his tablet. But inside he felt fatigue rolling in like a wave. He thought about Liz, about the way she looked at him yesterday. He wanted to fix it, but work pulled him like an anchor. By 5 o'clock, the crane operator reported that the problem had been resolved, but Jack had to stay behind to check the equipment. He wrote to Liz, "I'll be a little late. I'll be there soon." She did not answer, and this silence was worse than any reproach. When he finally got into the pickup, it was getting dark. There was a flower shop on the way, but Jack suddenly remembered that he hadn't checked the security report. "If you don't deliver it today, the customer will scold you." He turned towards the office, deciding that the flowers could wait. It will only take half an hour. The office was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. Jack sat down at the table, opened the report, and began making edits. His eyes burned with fatigue, but he forced himself to concentrate. Half an hour turned into an hour, then 2. When he finished, the clock showed 9 in the evening. He turned off the laptop and rubbed his face with his hands. Flowers. He forgot about the flowers. The store was already closed, and now there was no strength to go there. Jack felt something tighten in his chest, not anger, not disappointment, but something deeper. He failed Liz. Again. He got into the pickup truck and drove home, looking at the dark highway. He remembered how Liz once, many years ago, gave him a chamomile picked on the side of the road. "This is for you so you won't be so serious," she said, laughing. He still kept that chamomile, dried, in an old book on the shelf. But now he didn't know how to bring that laughter back into her life. When he entered the house, Liz was sitting in the living room with her laptop. She looked up but didn't say anything. Her face was tired, almost alien. There's money in the refrigerator, she said, returning to the screen. Thank you, Jack replied, feeling the words get stuck in his throat. He wanted to say something else, but instead he went into the kitchen. Flowers, he thought. Tomorrow. He will buy them tomorrow. But even that thought seemed empty, like a promise he didn't know if he could keep. Liz Carter looked out the window of the plane as it descended over New York City. The city spread out below like a shimmering sea of skyscrapers, and even through her fatigue, she felt a slight thrill. She had not been here for years, and something in this chaotic glow reminded her of the Liz who once dreamed of conquering the world. Nearby, Kate Morris was leafing through a fashion magazine, her bright red hair standing out against the gray salon. Kate hummed something under her breath, not paying attention to the flight attendant's announcements. Lizzie, are you ready for adventure? Kate poked her with her elbow, without looking up from the page with the perfume advertisement. New York, baby. We'll put on a show. Liz smiled weakly as she adjusted her seatbelt. I'm ready for the presentation, Kate. The rest is your territory. Kate rolled her eyes, slamming the magazine shut. Oh, stop it. The presentation for Bright Star is a couple of hours of tediousness. But after, she winked. I know a bar in Manhattan. Cocktails, music, atmosphere. You won't regret it. Liz wanted to object, but remained silent. Her thoughts were still at home in Chicago. Jack returned late yesterday, as usual, and their conversation was limited to a couple of phrases about Sophie's schedule. She wrote to him this morning. I'm arriving on Sunday. Sophie is at Emma's for the weekend. He answered briefly, okay, good luck. No questions, no, I miss you. She didn't know what she was expecting, but this indifference cut like a knife. The plane landed softly, and an hour later Liz and Kate were already checking into a hotel on 3rd Avenue. The room was standard white sheets, the smell of cleaning products, a view of the neighboring building. Liz dropped her suitcase by the bed and collapsed onto the mattress, feeling the fatigue rolling in like a wave. Hey, don't relax. Kate burst into her room, having already changed into a tight black dress. Presentation at 2, and then we go to Neon Pulse. I've reserved a table. Kate, I'm not sure, Liz began, but Kate interrupted by raising her hand. No, not sure. You promised, Lizzie. One evening. Just relax and be yourself. Not a mother, not a wife, but Liz Carter, the queen of marketing and just a firewoman. Liz laughed in spite of herself. Kate was ridiculous, but her enthusiasm was infectious. Okay, she gave in, but only a couple of cocktails, and none of your crazy ideas. I promise, Kate made an innocent face, but her eyes sparkled. Well, almost. The presentation for Bright Star went smoothly, although not without tension. The clients, a couple of stern men in expensive suits, asked tricky questions, but Liz was in her element. She spoke with confidence, her slides were impeccable, and Kate added jokes that lightened the atmosphere. By 5 o'clock, the deal was almost in the pocket, and Liz felt a little relieved. Maybe she still knew how to be the Liz who once lit up the meetings. Returning to the hotel, she wanted to order food to her room and go to bed, but Kate was already dragging her to the closet. Wear something bright, she commanded, rummaging through Liz's suitcase. This? She pulled out a red dress that Liz hadn't worn in years. Perfect. Jack will fall if he sees you in this. Jack is in Chicago, Liz answered dryly, but took the dress. She looked at herself in the mirror while Kate fussed with her makeup. The red dress fit better than she expected, emphasizing her figure. She ran her hand over the fabric, feeling a little out of place, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. By 8 p.m., they entered Neon Pulse, a bar in Lower Manhattan. The neon sign cast flashes of pink and blue, the music pulsated, and the air was permeated with a smell of citrus cocktails and expensive perfume. The crowd was younger than Liz expected, but Kate felt like a fish out of water, immediately ordering 2 margaritas. For us, Kate proclaimed, clinking glasses with Liz, because we are cool and deserve it. Liz smiled and took a sip. The cocktail was cold, with a slight sourness, and she felt the stress of the day dissolve. They sat at a table by the window, watching the people pass by, and Kate chatted incessantly about her second divorce, about the guy she met on Tinder, about how she hated her boss. Liz listened, sometimes laughing, and for the first time in a long time she felt light. An hour later, Kate suddenly jumped up, her eyes lighting up. "Oh, here it is." She waved to someone at the bar. "Mark, come here." Liz turned around and saw a man making his way to their table. About 35, dark hair, light stubble, a suit without a tie, but with that casual elegance that screamed about money. He smiled, and his eyes dark, with a sparkle settled on Liz. "Mark, this is Liz, my colleague and just a goddess," Kate introduced, clearly enjoying the moment. "Liz, this is Mark. He is a consultant who works with Brightstar. And by the way, he knows a lot about cocktails." "Nice to meet you, Liz," Mark said, extending his hand. His voice was low, with a slight accent that Liz couldn't recognize. "Kate warned you that you would steal all the attention." Liz shook his hand, feeling her cheeks warm. "Kate likes to exaggerate," she answered, trying to sound casual. "But thank you." Mark sat down with them, and the conversation flowed easily. He was charming not in an intrusive way, but naturally, with the confidence that comes with experience. He talked about his work, his trip to Tokyo, and how he once got stuck in an elevator with a client for 2 hours. Liz laughed and was surprised at how easy it was for her to be in his company. Kate added fuel to the fire by ordering more cocktails and egging Liz on. "Mark, tell her she looks like a movie star," Kate said with a wink. "She doesn't believe me." Mark looked at Liz, his gaze lingering a little longer than necessary. "Kate is right," he said, smiling. "This dress, it's like it was made for you." Liz felt the blood rush to her face. She took a sip of her margarita to hide her embarrassment. "You're both too kind," she replied, but her voice was softer than she expected. The atmosphere of the bar music, laughter, neon made everything easier. Liz felt younger, freer. Mark was attentive, asked questions, and listened when she talked about her work. He was not Jack, who remained silent, or Kate, who interrupted. He was different, and it was dangerous. Kate suddenly jumped up, grabbing her phone. "Oh, I need to call," she announced, clearly coming up with an excuse. "Liz, Mark, don't be bored without me." Liz wanted to object, but Kate had already disappeared into the crowd. She stayed with Mark, and the silence between them was not awkward, but charged. "Is Kate always like this?" Mark asked, nodding towards the bar. "Always," Liz laughed. "She's like a hurricane. But it would be boring without her." "And you?" He leaned a little closer. "Are you also a hurricane, or are you just pretending to be calm?" Liz looked at him, feeling his words touch something inside her. She wanted to say that she was just tired, that her life was a routine, not adventures. But instead she smiled. "Maybe I'm just waiting for the right moment," she replied, her voice lower than usual. Mark smiled, and there was a sparkle in his eyes. They continued talking about New York, about music, about stupid things they did when they were young. Liz felt her head spinning from the cocktails and his compliments. She flirted cautiously, but flirted nonetheless. It was like a game, like a return to the Liz who once danced in the rain. But somewhere in the depths of her soul, she heard a voice reminiscent of Jack, of Sophie, of home. The bar was pulsating with life. Neon lights reflected in glasses, music some kind of remix with deep bass poured into the blood, making Liz's heart beat faster. She sat at the table, her red dress riding up slightly as she laughed at another of Mark's stories. Kate, returning from her urgent call, ordered another round of margaritas, and Liz had already lost count of how many she drank. Alcohol spread through the veins, washing away fatigue and doubt, leaving only lightness and warmth. Mark leaned closer, his dark eyes sparkling in the darkness. "You know, Liz, you don't look like those who sit at presentations with a serious face," he said, smiling. "You have a spark. It's like you're just waiting to burst out." Liz laughed, brushing her hair off her shoulders. Her cheeks were burning, and she wasn't sure if it was from the cocktails or his gaze. "Oh, believe me, I'm a master at sitting with a serious face," she answered, playing along. "But maybe you're right. Sometimes you want to. I don't know, just live. Kate, who was sitting nearby, raised her glass. That's what we'll drink, she declared, her voice drowning out the music. For life, Lizzie. For not being a boring aunt. Liz rolled her eyes, but clinked glasses with her. Margarita's throat burned, and she felt the last barriers crumble. Kate was right, she was tired of being a boring aunt. Tired of the routine, of Jack's silence, of the fact that her life had become a series of identical days. Here, in this bar, with the neon and laughter, she felt different. Alive. Kate suddenly jumped up, grabbing Liz's hand. "Let's go dance," she stated, not accepting any objections. "Mark, are you with us?" Mark smiled but shook his head. "I'd better take a look," he said, his gaze lingering on Liz. "But don't let me get bored." Liz wanted to refuse, she hadn't danced in years, but Kate was already dragging her onto the dance floor. The music enveloped them, the crowd moved in rhythm, and Liz, succumbing to the impulse, began to move. Her body remembered what it was like to dissolve in the music, to laugh without thinking about tomorrow. Kate twirled nearby, her red hair flashing like fire. Liz closed her eyes, letting the rhythm carry her away. She was not a mother, she was not a wife. She was just Liz. When they returned to the table, out of breath and laughing, Mark greeted them with applause. "Bravo," he said, pushing Liz a new cocktail. "You are definitely the queen of this evening." Liz smiled as she accepted the glass. Her head was spinning, but not just from the alcohol. Mark looked at her as if he saw her not the Liz who cooks dinner and checks Sophie's homework, but the one who once danced in the rain. She knew it was dangerous, but she couldn't stop. Kate leaned towards her voice a whisper, but full of mischief. "Lizzie, he fell in love with you. Look how he's staring. When was the last time you flirted with someone other than your refrigerator?" Liz elbowed her, but laughed. "Stop it, Kate. I'm just resting." "Continue to rest," Kate winked. "Life is short, honey. Take everything from her." Liz took another sip, feeling Kate's words sink into her head. Take everything. She looked at Mark, who was saying something about his trip to Italy, and found herself smiling wider than necessary. His voice, his laughter, his lightness, it was all like a breath of fresh air after a long day in a stuffy room. The clock showed midnight when Kate announced that she was not ready to call it a day. But Liz could already feel the fatigue mixing with the alcohol, and her resolve began to melt. "I think I'll go back to the hotel," she said, getting up. Her legs trembled slightly, and she grabbed the edge of the table. Mark immediately stood up. "I'll take you," he offered, his tone soft but confident. "I don't want you to get lost in this chaos." Kate giggled but didn't object. "Go, Lizzie. Mark, take care of my girl." Liz wanted to say that she could handle it herself, but the words stuck. She nodded, and she and Mark left the bar. The street greeted them with coolness, and Liz took a deep breath, trying to put her thoughts in order. Mark walked next to her. His shoulder almost touched her, and she felt the warmth of his presence. "Are you okay?" he asked as they turned onto 3rd Avenue. The hotel was a couple of blocks away, and the lights of Manhattan illuminated their path. "Yes," Liz smiled, although her voice was slightly hoarse. "I just haven't been to a place like this for a long time. It's like another world. A good world." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her heart skip a beat. "Maybe," she answered, looking away. She knew she should stop, say something neutral, but instead she added, "He's definitely more interesting with you." Mark smiled, and they fell silent. The silence was warm, almost tangible. When they reached the hotel, Liz stood at the entrance, feeling reality wash over her. She had to say goodbye, get into the elevator, and go to bed. But her legs didn't move. "Thank you for seeing me off," she said, looking at him. "It was fun. It's not over if you don't want it to," Mark said quietly, his voice soft but with a spark in it. He stepped closer, and Liz felt her breath stop. She knew it was a mistake. She knew that Jack, Sophie, her life, all this was waiting for her in Chicago. But at this moment, under the neon lights of New York, she felt great, and she was tired of resisting. When Mark leaned in to kiss her, she didn't pull away. His lips were warm, and she responded, letting herself get lost in the moment. They entered the hotel, and the elevator took them upstairs. In her room, everything happened quickly, but not rudely, as if they both knew that it was fleeting, but did not want to think about the consequences. Liz surrendered to the moment, drowning out the voice of conscience that was screaming somewhere on the edge of consciousness. Mark was attentive, his hands were confident, and she allowed herself to forget about everything about the routine, about Jack, about her role. That night, she was just Liz. Morning burst into the room with a harsh light breaking through the curtains. Liz opened her eyes, and her head immediately began to throb. She was lying in bed, the sheet was rumpled, and next to no one. Mark left, leaving only a slight scent of cologne on the pillow. Liz sat up, feeling reality hit her like a cold shower. Her heart sank, and a wave of guilt washed over her. She spent the night with a strange man. She, Liz Carter, is Sophie's mother, Jack's wife. It was unthinkable, but it was true. She covered her face with her hands, trying to breathe evenly. What has she done? How could she? Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. Message from Kate. Hey, alive? How was the night? Liz clenched her teeth, feeling anger mixed with panic. She dialed Kate's number, and she answered on the first ring. Lizzie, come on, Kate giggled. Tell me how it all happened. Kate, this isn't funny. Liz's voice trembled. I slept with him. God, I don't know how this happened. I shouldn't have. Hey, calm down. Kate immediately became serious, but her tone was light. Liz, this is New York. It was just night. You drank, relaxed, no big deal. Nobody will know. No one will know. Liz almost screamed. Kate, I'm married. I have a daughter. How will I look at Jack now? Oh, honey, stop it, Kate sighed. Jack doesn't even notice when you get your hair cut. It doesn't mean anything. Just a little secret. You're not going to Las Vegas with Mark, are you? It was just flirting that went a little further. Liz was silent, her fingers clutching the phone. Kate's words sounded logical, but they did not drown out the feeling that was tearing her apart from the inside. She betrayed Jack, betrayed Sophie. She betrayed herself. I don't know what to do, she finally whispered. Do as I do, Kate replied, and there was a familiar nonchalance in her voice. Forget. This is New York, baby. Everything remains here. Come home, kiss your husband, and everything will be as before. Liz hung up without answering. She stood up and went to the mirror. Her face was pale. There were shadows under her eyes. She looked like a stranger. But Kate was right about one thing no one will know. It was a mistake, one night. She can live with this. Should. She gathered her things, trying not to look at the rumpled bed. Her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to move. She will return to Chicago, to Sophie, to Jack, and everything will be as before. Only now she knew that a part of her remained here, in this room, and she would never be able to return it. Liz Carter sat in a taxi, looking out the window at the gray suburbs of Chicago. The sky was overcast, and light rain knocked on the glass, blurring the outlines of the houses. Her suitcase lay next to her, and it was as if a cold lump was stuck in her chest. The flight from New York was short, but every kilometer brought her closer to the reality she wanted to escape. She hadn't slept most of the night, her eyes were red, and her head was buzzing with a hangover and endless thoughts. What has she done? How will she look at Jack? On Sophie? The taxi driver, an elderly man with a thick mustache, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Was it a long trip? He asked, clearly trying to break the silence. That's enough, Liz replied, her voice hoarse. She turned to the window, not wanting to continue the conversation. Her fingers nervously fiddled with the strap of her bag, and Kate's voice was spinning in her head. It doesn't mean anything. No one will know. But Liz knew it was a lie. She knew, and this knowledge corroded her from the inside. When the taxi stopped at the house, Liz froze for a second, looking at the familiar white fence and flower bed with withered asters. The house looked the same as always, cozy, but slightly shabby, like their marriage. She took a deep breath, paid the driver, and walked out into the rain, dragging her suitcase along the wet path. It was quiet inside. Sophie should have returned from Emma's an hour ago, and Jack was most likely at work. Liz dropped her suitcase at the door and walked into the kitchen, which smelled of coffee and toast. There was a note from Sophie on the table. "Mom, I'm at home. I went to my room and I'm doing my homework. I love you." Liz smiled faintly, but her hand trembled as she took the paper. Sophie, her girl. How could she let her down like that? She poured herself some water, but didn't drink it, just clutched the glass as if it could keep her from falling. Her thoughts were racing. Should she tell Jack? Forget? Kate was right, no one will know. But Liz knew that this secret would live in her like poison, poisoning every look, every word. Sophie sat cross-legged on her bed with her laptop in her lap. She tried to concentrate on her literature essay, but her thoughts kept returning to her parents. Hearing the creak of the front door, Sophie jumped up and ran downstairs. "Mom!" she shouted, flying into the kitchen. Liz stood at the sink, still in her coat, her hair damp from the rain. "You're back!" Liz turned around and Sophie froze. Mom's face was pale, there were shadows under her eyes, and her smile seemed strained, like a mask. "Hello, honey," Liz said, putting the glass on the table. Her voice was soft, but there was something alien in it. "How are you? How is Emma?" "Okay," Sophie frowned, coming closer. "We watched movies, ate tacos. Are you okay? You look like you haven't slept." Liz looked away, her fingers gripping the edge of the sink. "I'm just tired," she answered, too quickly. "Business trip, flight, all that. It's okay." Sophie narrowed her eyes. She knew her mother, she knew how she wrinkled her nose when she lied, how her voice became a little higher. Something was wrong, very wrong. "Mom, are you sure you're okay?" she asked, crossing her arms. "You're kind of, I don't know, strange." Liz forced herself to smile, but her eyes remained empty. "Sophie, I'm fine. Is it true? You just need to rest." She stepped towards her daughter and hugged her, but the hug was short, almost mechanical. "Tell me what's new with you." Sophie wanted to object, but something in her mother's face stopped her. She shrugged, deciding not to push. "Nothing special. I'm finishing my essay on Shakespeare." Boredom. Liz nodded, but Sophie could see she wasn't listening. Her gaze was somewhere far away, as if she was looking through the walls. Sophie felt a pang of anxiety, but said nothing. She returned to her room, but promised herself to keep an eye out. If Mom doesn't want to talk, she'll figure out what's going on another way. Jack returned home around 7 in the evening. His jacket was damp from the rain, and his boots left muddy footprints on the floor. The construction site was held today. The supplier screwed up the beams again, and Jack had to spend half a day sorting out the paperwork. He was exhausted, but the thought of Liz returning from New York kept him going. He found her in the living room, sitting on the sofa with a glass of wine. The TV was on, but the sound was off, and the screen was flashing frames of some kind of advertisement. Liz looked different. Her face was pale, and her hair, usually neatly styled, fell over her shoulders in tangled strands. Jack froze in the doorway, feeling something tighten in his chest. "Hi," he said, throwing the keys on the table. "How was the trip?" Liz looked up, and for a second her gaze was blank, as if she didn't immediately recognize him. Then she smiled, but the smile was weak, almost forced. "Fine," she answered, her voice quiet. "The presentation went well. Clients are happy." Jack nodded, not knowing what to say. He wanted to ask how she was, if everything was really okay, but the words were stuck. Instead, he walked into the kitchen and poured himself some water, feeling the silence between them grow heavier. "Is Sophie at home?" he asked, returning to the living room. In her room, Liz took a sip of wine without looking at him. "She has an essay." Jack sat down in the chair opposite him, his fingers gripping his glass. He looked at Liz, trying to understand what had changed. She was the same, but different. Her movements were sharp, her eyes avoided him. He remembered how she had gone to bed after the dinner that Sophie had arranged, and how he could not find the words to stop her. Maybe this was a continuation of that evening. Maybe he missed something again. "Are you tired?" he asked, trying to sound softer. "You look. I don't know. I'm exhausted." Liz tensed, her fingers gripping the glass tighter. "Just a flight," she answered, too quickly. "And work." "Nothing like that." Jack nodded, but didn't believe it. He knew Liz knew how she fiddled with her sleeve when she was nervous, how her voice became a little higher when she was hiding something. But he didn't know how to ask. His father taught that a man does not interfere in other people's thoughts, but solves problems. But what was Liz's problem? He didn't know. "If something is wrong, tell me," he finally managed, but his voice sounded harsher than he intended. Liz looked at him, and something flashed in her eyes, pain, fear, maybe, anger. But she just shook her head. "It's okay, Jack. Just let me rest." She got up and went upstairs, leaving the glass on the table. Jack looked after her, feeling something inside him shrink. He didn't know what was happening, but he felt it was more than fatigue. Kate Morris sat in the office cafeteria, her high-heeled foot dangling. Her bright green blouse stood out against the gray walls, and a small group of colleagues had already gathered around her, sipping coffee and lazily discussing the past week. Kate, as usual, was the center of attention, her voice drowning out the hum of the coffee machine. She loved these gatherings, a moment when she could share gossip, laugh, and feel like a star. But today her lightness played a cruel joke on her. "Well, Liz and I had a blast in New York," Kate giggled, stirring her latte. "The bar was on fire, the cocktails were simply cosmos. And girls, you should have seen Liz. She's a total rock star in that red dress." Melissa, a designer with sharp cheekbones and an eternally skeptical gaze, raised an eyebrow. "Liz, our Liz Carter, the one who is always with a laptop and a 'I have a deadline' face." She snorted. "I don't believe it." But in vain, Kate leaned closer, her eyes sparkling. She was dancing, laughing, and then she paused for effect, not noticing how her voice was getting louder. "Then I left with this hot consultant, Mark. Well, you understand. Fun night." Kate laughed, expecting her colleagues to join in, but instead there was silence. Melissa coughed, and another colleague, Sarah from accounting, stared at her coffee as if it contained a treasure map. Kate frowned, not understanding what was wrong. "What?" she asked, shrugging. "This is New York. Everyone does it." Melissa leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a thin smile. "Kate, are you serious? Liz is married. She has a child. You just said she was. You know, with another guy." Kate froze, her hand holding the spoon hovering over the cup. She suddenly realized that she had said too much. Her cheeks turned pink, but she tried to brush it off. "Oh, come on, it's not what you think. Just flirting, cocktails, nothing like that." She laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "Forget it, okay." But it was too late. Melissa had already exchanged a glance with Sarah, and Kate knew that look of gossip was born, and it could not be stopped. She jumped up, muttering something about the call, and hurried to her desk, feeling her heart pounding. She didn't want to hurt Liz. It was just talk, a stupid mistake. But deep down she knew that this mistake would be costly. By noon, the gossip spread through the office like smoke. Melissa told a friend in sales, she whispered to her friend, and he mentioned it over lunch with colleagues from another company. By evening, word reached Tom Ridley, an old friend of Jack's who worked at a construction firm a couple of blocks from Liz's office. Tom was in a meeting with a client when a friend of his, who knew someone in Liz's marketing department, said casually, "I heard that Carter's wife had a blast in New York. Some guy, bar, stuff like that." Tom frowned, putting his burger down. "What? Liz? Are you serious?" "Yes, there are rumors," the guy shrugged. "They say her colleagues spilled the beans. Maybe just chatter, but you know how it goes." Tom remained silent, but his face darkened. He had known Jack since school. They drank beer together in the backyard and worked on their first cars together. Jack wasn't the type to gossip, but Tom felt it was more than just chatter. He finished his coffee and decided that he should tell. Not for drama, but because Jack deserved to know. Jack stood by his pickup truck at the construction site, checking the delivery report. It was a hard day. The beams finally arrived, but the welders again delayed the deadline, and the customer was breathing down his neck. Jack was engrossed in numbers when his phone vibrated. He saw Tom's name and answered, pressing the phone to his ear. "Hey, Tom, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice tired but friendly. "Jack, where are you?" Tom's voice was unusually serious. "We need to talk." On the landing, Jack frowned, feeling something tighten in his chest. "What's happened?" Tom hesitated, and this pause was worse than any words. "Listen, I don't know how to say this. There are rumors about Liz, about her trip to New York." Jack froze, his fingers gripping the phone. "What rumors?" His voice became lower, almost threatening. Tom sighed. "They say well, I spent the night with some guy. At the bar. Her colleagues spilled the beans in the office, and now they are discussing it. This may be nonsense, Jack, but I thought you should know." The world around Jack seemed to slow down. The noise of construction, the clanging of metal, the screams of workers receded, leaving only a hum in my ears. He felt the blood drain from his face, and his heart beat as if it wanted to break out. Liz, his Liz, with someone else. It was impossible, unthinkable. "Who said?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as if the words were cutting his throat. "I don't know for sure," Tom spoke carefully. "Rumors from her office." "Jack, I'm not sure that's true. Maybe just chatter." "Talk to her." Jack was silent. He looked at the tablet in his hand, but the numbers were blurry. He remembered Liz, who had returned from New York, her pale face, her distant gaze, her sharp answers. He felt something was wrong, but it was like a blow to the chest. "Thank you for telling me," he finally managed, his voice empty. "I'll sort it out." He hung up and stood there, motionless. The workers around him continued to bustle, but for Jack everything stopped. He tried to remember Liz, her laughter, her warmth, their youth. But instead I saw only her cold eyes, her silence. He clenched his fists, feeling anger and pain mixing like concrete in a mixer. Jack knew he had to go home. I have to look her in the eyes and ask. But part of him was afraid of the answer. He tossed the tablet onto the seat of the pickup truck and got behind the wheel. Sophie Carter sat on the floor of her room, leaning against her bed. Her laptop was open on an essay on literature, but the cursor had been blinking on a blank line for half an hour. Outside the window, the Chicago suburb was drowning in twilight, and the streetlights came on one after another, casting yellow spots on the wet asphalt. Sophie couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts revolved around her parents, and the more she thought, the heavier her heart became. Ever since my mother returned from New York, the house seemed to be shrouded in shadow. Liz was quiet, almost ghostly. She was preparing dinner, asking about school, but her eyes were empty, as if she was looking through everything around her. Dad has changed too. Jack had always been silent, but now his silence was different, heavy, almost angry. Sophie noticed the way he looked at her mother when he thought no one was looking. Not with love, but with something she couldn't name. They barely spoke, and even at dinner, when Sophie tried to fill the silence with jokes, her words fell into emptiness. She closed her laptop and rubbed her eyes. Her dinner plan had failed, but she didn't want to give up. Her parents loved each other, she knew that. She saw it in old photographs, heard it in her mother's stories about how her father once stole daisies for her from a neighbor's flower bed. Somewhere under this routine, under this silence, their love was still there. There should have been. Sophie stood up and walked to the closet. On the top shelf, behind the boxes of her old drawings, lay a tattered cardboard box that my mother called the chest of memories. Sophie hadn't looked there for a long time. The last time was probably when she was in 5th grade and looking for something for a school project. She pulled out the box, raising a cloud of dust, and sat down with it on the floor. Inside there was everything mixed up. Photographs, letters, postcards, even tickets to the concert where, according to Mom, Dad first told her that he loved her. Sophie picked up a stack of photographs tied with faded ribbon. The first one was my mother, young, with long hair, in a bright yellow sundress. She laughed, standing on the shore of Lake Michigan, and her dad, in jeans and a t-shirt, looked at her with a smile that Sophie rarely saw now. Another photo showed them dancing awkwardly but happily at a party, surrounded by friends. Another showed them with a baby. It was her, Sophie, wrapped in a blanket, and Mom and Dad looked tired but proud. Sophie felt her throat tighten. She put the photographs aside and picked up the letters. They were old, handwritten, with slightly faded ink. One was from my dad, dated 2003, when he and my mom had just started dating. Sophie unfolded the paper, feeling a little guilty, but couldn't stop herself. Liz, you probably think I can't talk about feelings, and you're right. But when I'm with you, I don't need words. You make me feel like I can be better than I am. I don't know how you do it, but don't stop. Yours, Jack. Sophie read the letter twice, her fingers trembling. Dad wrote this. Her dad, who now barely speaks more than 2 words at dinner. She took another letter from her mother, written a year later. Jack, you're the most stubborn person I know, but I wouldn't want you any other way. You're my home, even when we argue over your stupid blueprints. I love you, and that's forever. Liz. Sophie clutched the letter to her chest, feeling tears sting her eyes. She didn't cry, she didn't want to. But these words, these photographs were like a window into another life, where her parents were not just mom and dad, but people who loved each other so much that it was felt even through paper. She had to remind them of this, should have made them remember. She stood up, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and took a blank sheet of paper. Her hand shook, but she began to write, trying to be honest without being too sentimental. She didn't want it to seem like a childish request, she wanted them to hear it. Mom, Dad, I know you're not in a good place right now. I see you moving away, and it scares me. But I found your old photos and letters, and I know that you love each other. You've been through so much moving, my illness when I was little, your quarrels. But you always chose to be together. I don't know what's going on, but please don't give up. You are the best parents because you are a team. Talk. Remember why you chose each other. I believe in you. I love. Sophie. She reread the letter, added a couple of lines, crossed them out, then decided that it was good enough. Her handwriting was uneven but sincere. Sophie chose 3 photographs, the one where they danced, the one from the lake, and the one where they held her as a newborn. She put the letter and photographs in an envelope she found in her desk drawer and went down to the living room. Liz was in the kitchen, cooking something that smelled like herbs and garlic. Jack hasn't returned from work yet. Sophie placed the envelope on the coffee table in the living room next to the TV remote, where it would definitely be noticed. She wanted to leave a note, but changed her mind. The envelope spoke for itself. She looked at him for another second, feeling a mixture of hope and fear, and went to her friend. Liz came out of the kitchen with a bowl of salad when she noticed the envelope. She frowned, put the bowl on the table, and took it. Her fingers froze when she saw the photographs placed inside. Her heart sank, and she felt the guilt that had never left her in New York become unbearable. She recognized these photographs, their youth, their love, their beginning. And then she read Sophie's letter. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. She squeezed the envelope, feeling it burn her fingers. Sophie saw it. Sophie knew, and this was worse than any reproach. Liz wanted to go to her, hug her, tell her that everything would be okay, but she couldn't. Not now, when her own mistake hung over her like a shadow. She heard the front door open. Jack. His steps were heavy, and she knew he was in a bad mood. Liz quickly hid the envelope in her desk drawer, not ready to share it with him. Not now. She wiped her eyes and went to the kitchen, pretending that everything was fine. Jack walked in, his face stony. He threw his jacket on the chair and looked at Liz, but his gaze was colder than usual. Jack Carter pushed the front door, and its creak echoed in the quiet house. He threw the keys on the table by the entrance, feeling the weight of the rumors he had heard from Tom pressing on his shoulders. All day at the construction site, he tried to drown them out with work drawings, calls, disputes with contractors. But Tom's words were spinning in his head like a broken record. Liz was sitting on the sofa, holding a mug of tea. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her face looked tired, almost gray. She looked up as Jack entered, and her lips twitched into a faint smile. "You're early," she said, her voice soft but tense. "Dinner in the kitchen, if you want." Jack froze in the doorway, his fingers gripping the hem of his jacket. He wanted to be calm, as always. I wanted to sit down, eat, and pretend that everything was fine. But the rumors burned him from the inside, and he knew that he could not remain silent. Not today. "Liz," he began, his voice low, almost hoarse. "We need to talk." Liz tensed, her fingers clenching around her mug. She looked at him, and there was a look of fear in her eyes that he had never seen before. "About what?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but her voice was shaking. Jack took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. He tried to control himself, as his father taught him men don't shout, men decide. But everything was boiling inside. "About New York," he said, looking into her eyes. "About what happened there, I heard rumors." Liz turned pale, her mug almost slipped out of her hands. She placed it on the table. Her movements were sharp, almost panicky. "Rumors?" she asked, her voice higher than usual. "Jack, this is nonsense. You know how people talk. Kate's just... she's talking nonsense as always." Jack looked at her, and her every gesture, every word confirmed his worst fears. He knew Liz, he knew how she fidgets with her sleeve when she lies, how her eyes dart, avoiding his gaze. He stepped closer, his voice became firmer. "Don't lie to me, Liz," he said, and there was more pain than anger in his tone. "I see what you are hiding. Just tell the truth. What happened in New York?" Liz opened her mouth, but the words stuck. Her eyes filled with tears, and she turned away, putting a hand to her mouth. Silence hung between them, heavy as a concrete slab. Jack waited, his heart pounding, but he didn't move. He wanted her to refute everything, to say that it was a lie. But her silence was the answer. Liz finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "Jack, I didn't mean to. It was a mistake. Error." Jack stepped towards her, his voice breaking. For the first time in years, he lost control, and the restraint he was so proud of cracked like glass. "Did you sleep with someone, Liz? Is this what you call a mistake?" Liz shuddered, her tears running down her cheeks. She looked at him, her face a mixture of guilt and despair. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, Jack. I was drunk. I was stupid. I don't know how it happened. But that doesn't mean anything. It was one night, and I regret it every second." Jack felt the ground disappear from under his feet. He expected this, but hearing the truth was like a blow. His hands shook, and he clenched them into fists to keep from screaming. He wanted to ask who it was, why, how she could. But instead, he just looked at her, feeling the pain tearing him apart from the inside. "Why?" he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "Liz, why? I tried. For you, for Sophie. What did I do wrong?" Liz sobbed, her hands falling limply to her knees. "You didn't do anything, Jack. It's not you. It's me. I felt lonely. You are always at work, always silent. I tried to talk, tried to get through, but you're like a wall. I didn't want this, but that night I wanted to feel alive." Her words cut like a knife. Jack turned away, his gaze falling on the coffee table where the frame with their wedding photo lay. He remembered how Liz laughed that day, how her eyes sparkled. He loved her then. He loved her now. But this love was now mixed with pain that seemed unbearable. "I don't know how to fix this," he said, his voice empty. "I don't know, Liz." She stood up, stepping towards him, her hands shaking. "Jack, please. It was a mistake. I love you. I love Sophie. We can survive this. I will do everything to—" "No need," he interrupted, raising his hand. His eyes were cold, but there was pain in them that he could not hide. "I need time." He turned and went into the bedroom. Liz remained standing, her sobs echoing in the silence. Jack pulled out a duffel bag from the closet and began throwing things into it: shirts, jeans, a toothbrush. His movements were mechanical, but every object he picked up was a reminder of their life. The t-shirt Liz gave him for his birthday, the book they read together. He stopped, clutching her old scarf in his hands, and felt tears burning his eyes. He hadn't cried since childhood, but now he was close to it. Liz walked into the bedroom, her face wet with tears. "Jack, don't go," she begged, her voice trembling. "Please. We can talk. We can." "I can't now, Liz," he said without looking at her. "I need to think." He zipped up his bag and walked past her without stopping. She grabbed his arm, but he gently pulled away. The door slammed and Liz was left alone, her sobs drowned out by the sound of rain outside the window. Jack got into his pickup truck and drove off, not knowing where. The rain pattered on the windshield, and the windshield wipers squeaked like his thoughts. He stopped at a motel on the outskirts of town, a cheap one with a neon sign that flashed the letter M. The room smelled of dampness and cigarettes, but Jack didn't care. He threw the bag on the floor and sat on the bed, staring at the wall. He thought about Liz, about how she laughed when they were young, how she danced at their wedding, how she held Sophie in the maternity hospital. He loved her so much it was scary, but her betrayal was like a crack in the foundation that he had been building all his life. He remembered her words, "I felt lonely," and that cut the hardest, because he knew she was right. He was a wall. He didn't know how to talk about feelings, didn't know how to be what she wanted. But he tried for her, for Sophie. Was this not enough? Liz Carter sat on the living room couch, clutching an empty mug. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of rain outside the window. The light of the lamp cast long shadows on the walls, and each of them seemed to be an echo of her guilt. Jack left. His steps, the slam of the door, the sound of the pickup truck's engine, all this still sounded in her head like the echo of a nightmare. She wanted to run after him, begging him to stay, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor. She destroyed everything they had built for 20 years, and now she was left alone, face to face with emptiness. Her gaze fell on the coffee table, where there was an envelope that Sophie had left a couple of days ago. Liz hasn't opened it since she read it for the first time. It was too painful to see her daughter's words, her faith in their family. But now, in this silence, she reached out to him, like a drowning man to a life preserver. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out the letter and photographs. The photographs were old, with slightly faded edges. In one, she and Jack danced at a party, their faces lit up with laughter. In another, they stood on the shore of Lake Michigan, Jack hugging her, and she squinted in the sun. The third was the hardest she and the newborn Sophie, tired but happy, holding her like the most valuable treasure. Liz ran her finger over the pictures, feeling tears sting her eyes. She unfolded Sophie's letter, her neat handwriting blurring before her eyes. "Mom, Dad, you've been through so much. Please don't give up." Liz sobbed, clutching the letter to her chest. Sophie believed in them. I believed, despite their silence, their detachment, their mistakes. Liz remembered how she and Jack overcame difficulties. The financial crisis when they struggled to make ends meet. Sophie's illness when she was hospitalized with pneumonia at age 3. Their quarrels that ended in hugs. They were a team. But now she had ruined it, and the thought of it was unbearable. Liz stood up and walked into the bedroom, her steps heavy, as if she was carrying the whole world on her shoulders. She opened the closet and took out the old box containing their memories, the same one Sophie had found. Inside were letters, postcards, tickets to their first joint concert. She took one of Jack's letters, written when they first started dating. "Liz, you make me feel like I can be better." She closed her eyes, feeling tears running down her cheeks. She still loved him. She loved so much that it tore her apart from the inside. But how could she ask for forgiveness when her mistake was so huge? She walked back into the living room, clutching the letter, and sat on the floor, leaning against the sofa. Her thoughts were spinning. New York, Mark, the bar, her weakness. She didn't want this. She wanted to feel alive, but instead she lost everything that mattered. She remembered Kate saying, "Nobody will know." But Liz knew, and now Jack knew. And this truth was like poison, poisoning every breath. Sophie walked into the house around 8 p.m., her backpack slung over one shoulder. She was at Emma's, trying to distract herself from the difficult atmosphere at home. but her thoughts kept returning to her parents. She noticed that Dad's pickup truck was not parked in front of the house, and this immediately raised an alarm. She pushed the door open, expecting to hear her mother's voice or the sound of the TV, but instead she was met with silence. "Mom," Sophie called, taking off her sneakers. She walked into the living room and froze. Liz sat on the floor, surrounded by photographs and papers. Her face was wet with tears, and her eyes were red. Sophie felt her heart clench. She had never seen her mother like this, broken, almost broken. "Mom, what happened?" Sophie dropped her backpack and sat down next to her, her voice trembling. "Where is Dad?" Liz looked up, her gaze filled with pain. She wanted to lie, to say that everything was fine, but Sophie's words, her letter, her faith, all this broke the last barriers. Liz couldn't hide anymore. "Not from my daughter." "Sophie," she began, her voice hoarse, I did a terrible thing. In New York. She fell silent, her hands trembling. "I slept with another man. It was a mistake, but I can't fix it. Dad found out. He left." Sophie froze, her eyes widening. She felt the world falling apart. Her mom, her perfect mom who always kept everything together, did this. It was impossible. But Liz's tears, her trembling voice, everything was true. Sophie wanted to scream, to run away, but instead she remained sitting, looking at her mother. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice full of pain. "Mom, how are you? You and Dad. You love each other." Liz sobbed, her hands falling limply to her knees. "I love him, Sophie. I've always loved it. But I felt alone. It's not an excuse, I know. I destroyed everything, and I don't know how to fix it." Sophie was silent, her eyes filled with tears. She thought about the letter, about the photographs, about how much she wanted to save her family, and now it all seemed meaningless. But then she looked at her mother, at her tears, at her pain, and felt that she could not leave her. "Not now." "Mom," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "don't give up. Please. Daddy loves you. I know he loves it. He'll be back. You need to talk. You must fight." Liz looked at her eyes full of despair. "Sophie, I don't know if he can forgive. I don't know if I deserve this." "You deserve it." Sophie grabbed her hand, her fingers trembling. "You both deserve it. You are my parents. You can't just fall apart. Please, Mom. Call him. Talk." Liz nodded, but her gaze was blank. She hugged Sophie, and they sat there on the floor, surrounded by photographs and letters. Liz felt her daughter's warmth, her faith, and this was the only thing that kept her from completely falling. She didn't know if Jack would come back. She didn't know if she could forgive herself. But Sophie's words, her pleading voice, lit a tiny spark of hope. Maybe all is not lost yet. Maybe they could still try. Sophie sat on her bed, clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles were white. Her room, usually her sanctuary, seemed cramped today, almost stuffy. The rain was still drizzling outside the window, and its monotonous knocking only increased her anxiety. The conversation with her mother, her tears, her confession was still before her eyes, like a scene from a film that she did not want to watch. Sophie felt crushed, but somewhere deep inside her soul, there was a spark of stubbornness. She couldn't let her family fall apart. Not after everything she had seen in their letters, in their photographs, in their past. She opened her contacts and found her dad's number. Her finger hovered over the call button. What will she say? How do you get him to come back when he probably hates his mom? But Sophie knew Jack knew that beneath his silence, beneath his stony face, was the man who loved them. She took a deep breath and pressed call. The phone buzzed for a long time, and with each ring her heart beat faster. Finally, she heard his voice, hoarse and tired. "Sophie," said Jack, "what's happened?" "Dad," her voice trembled, but she forced herself to speak. "Where are you? You must return home." There was silence on the other end of the line, and Sophie imagined him sitting somewhere in a car, in a motel, alone. She clutched the phone tighter. "Sophie, Jack began, but she interrupted. "No, Dad, listen. I know what happened. Mom told me. It's terrible, I know. But she loves you. And I know that you love her. please come back. Talk. Don't leave us." Her voice broke, and she felt tears sting her eyes. She didn't want to cry, but the words came out on their own, full of pain and hope. Jack was silent, and the silence was almost unbearable. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, almost broken. "I don't know, Sophie. I don't know if I can." "Dad, you have to try," she begged. "For yourself. For me. For Mom. For us. Please." Silence again, but now it was different, not empty, but heavy, as if Jack was weighing every word. Finally, he sighed. "Okay," he said, "I will come, but I need time." "Thank you, Dad," Sophie whispered, her voice shaking. "I love you." "I love you too," he replied, and she heard him clear his throat as if hiding his emotions. Sophie hung up and wiped her eyes with her sleeve. She didn't know what would happen next, but she did everything she could. Jack sat in his pickup truck in the motel parking lot, looking at the rain running down the windshield. His bag lay on the passenger seat, and the air smelled of dampness and gasoline. Sophie's call was like a blow, not angry, but soft, but this made it even more painful. Her voice, her plea, all this pierced his armor, which he had so carefully built. He loved Sophie more than life itself, and the thought of her suffering because of his and Liz's mistakes was unbearable. He thought about Liz, about her confession, about her tears, about her words. "I felt lonely." He hated her for what she did, but he hated himself even more for bringing her to this. He knew that he was a wall his father had drilled into him, that a man should be strong, silent, reliable. But Liz didn't need a wall. She needed him real, open, vulnerable, and he failed her. Jack started the engine and drove home. The road was washed out from the rain, but he drove slowly, collecting his thoughts. He didn't know what he would say. I didn't know if he could forgive me. But Sophie was right, he had to try. When he entered the house, Liz was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea. She looked up and her face turned pale. Jack froze in the doorway, feeling his heart clench. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're back." He nodded, not trusting his voice. He took off his jacket and sat down opposite. His hands lay on the table as if looking for support. The silence between them was thick, almost palpable, but Jack knew it was necessary. "Sophie called," he began, his voice low but calm. "She asked to come back. She said we should talk." Liz nodded, her fingers tightening around her mug. She knows," she said, her voice trembling. "I told her. Jack, I don't know how to fix this. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but Wait," he interrupted, raising his hand. His eyes met hers, and there was pain in them, but not anger. "I want to say, Liz, I know I let you down. I've always been closed." He didn't know how to speak or show. "My father, he taught that a man should be strong, keep everything to himself. But I see now that it was wrong. You felt alone, and that's my fault too." Liz looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. She'd never heard Jack talk like that, openly, vulnerable. It was like a window slightly open in his soul, and she was afraid that it would close. "Jack, it's not your fault," she said, her voice breaking. "I made a choice. I was weak. I was tired of the routine, of feeling invisible. But that's no excuse. I love you. I've always loved it, and I'm so sorry." She fell silent, her tears dripping onto the table. Jack looked at her, feeling his own pain mingling with hers. He wanted to hate her, but he couldn't. He loved her even now, even after everything. He reached out and covered her hand with his fingers warm but trembling. "I don't know how to get through this," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "But I know I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us." Liz sobbed, squeezing his hand. "I'll do anything, Jack. Anything to regain your trust. I can't lose you. I can't lose Sophie." They sat like that, holding hands, in silence, which was now not heavy, but fragile, like the first step on thin ice. Jack knew that forgiveness would not come immediately, knew they had a long way to go. But for the first time in years, he felt that I was speaking not only for the sake of words, but for their sake, for the sake of their family. Liz looked at him, her eyes full of pain, but also hope. She knew she didn't deserve this chance, but she was willing to fight. For Jack, for Sophie, for myself. The Carters' kitchen was bathed in the soft light of the morning sun filtering through the curtains. The rain that had been pouring all night finally stopped, leaving the freshness and smell of wet grass outside the window. Liz and Jack sat at the table, their hands still intertwined, as if that gesture was the only thing keeping them together. Liz's mug of cold tea stood untouched, and Jack looked at his fingers, fingering her palm, as if trying to make sure that she was real. Last night's conversation, their words, their tears, their confessions had left them both empty, but for the first time in a long time, there was something alive in that silence. Not peace, but hope. Liz looked up, her gaze tired but clear. "Jack," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "I know I can't just ask for forgiveness and expect everything to go back to the way it was before. But I want to try. I want us to work on this. Together." Jack nodded, his face serious. He still felt the pain sharp as a shard of glass, but her words, her hand in his, reminded him why he had returned. He loved her, even after everything, even with this scar that may never heal. But love wasn't just a feeling, it was a choice, and he wanted to make that choice. "I want it too," he said, his voice hoarse. "But Liz, it won't be easy. I don't know how to trust again, and I don't want us to pretend that nothing happened." Liz squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I know, and I don't want to pretend. Maybe we need help?" She hesitated, her cheeks turning pink. "I was thinking about therapy, about the family therapist, so that we can speak honestly." Jack frowned, his instinct the one his father had instilled in him resisting. Men don't go to therapists. Men solve problems themselves. But he looked at Liz, at her vulnerability, at her desire to fight, and realized that his old rules no longer worked. If he wants to save their marriage, he must change, must try. "Okay," he said, and his voice was firmer than he expected. "Therapy. We'll find someone. But Liz—" He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "We must be honest. Fully. No secrets." Liz nodded, her tears dripping onto the table. "No secrets," she whispered. "I promise, Jack. I will do anything to get us back." He squeezed her hand, and there was more in that gesture than words could express. They weren't intact, not yet, but they were here, together, and this was the first step. They decided to give marriage a chance, not because it was easy, but because their love, even battered, even wounded, was still worth the fight. Sophie pushed open the front door, her backpack hitting her back hard. She spent the morning at Emma's, trying to take her mind off her parents, but her heart yearned to go home. She was afraid of what she would see: an empty house, her mother's tears, or worse, nothing. But when she entered, she was greeted by the smell of coffee and the quiet hum of voices from the kitchen. She froze, listening. It was Mom and Dad. They spoke, they did not shout, they did not remain silent, but they spoke. She walked carefully into the kitchen, her sneakers squeaking on the wooden floor. Liz and Jack were sitting at the table, their hands intertwined, and that was the first thing Sophie noticed. Her heart did a somersault. She hadn't seen them holding hands in how long? Years? 2? Their faces were tired, but there was something new in them, not joy, but determination. "Hey," Sophie said, her voice cautious. "I'm home." Liz looked up and her face softened. "Sophie, honey," she said, her voice warm despite her fatigue. "Come here." Sophie walked over, dropping her backpack by the door. She looked at her dad, expecting his usual silence, but Jack smiled weakly, but sincerely. "I'm glad you're home," he said, and there was an unusual softness in his voice. Sophie sat up, her eyes darting between her parents. She wanted to ask what happened, if everything was okay, but she was afraid to ruin this moment. Liz, as if reading her thoughts, spoke first. "Dad and I talked," she said, her hand still in Jack's. We decided to try. Work on yourself, on us. It won't be easy, but we want to be a family. For you. For us." Sophie felt tears sting her eyes, but she smiled. "This is cool," she said, her voice shaking, I knew you could. You, you are you. Jack chuckled, and there was a trace of his old laugh in the sound. Thank you, Sophie, he said. If it weren't for you, I'd probably still be sitting in that motel. Sophie rolled her eyes, but her smile widened. Well, why do you have me? Liz laughed, and the sound was like a ray of sunshine on a cloudy day. They sat at the table, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt that her family was not ideal, not whole, but still hers here with her. She saw her parents holding hands, and it was more than she could ask for. Hope, fragile but real, settled in her heart. Later that day, Liz found a family therapist's business card that a friend had given her. She called and made an appointment for the following week. Her hand trembled as she dialed the number, but Jack stood next to her, and his presence gave her strength. They knew therapy was just the beginning. The trust they lost will not be regained overnight, but they were ready to work, to talk, to listen, to learn to be honest. Sophie went to her room to finally finish her essay, but her thoughts were light for the first time in weeks. She thought about her parents, about their hands intertwined at the table, about the way her dad smiled. She knew it would be hard ahead. Trust cannot be repaired like a broken shelf, but she believed in them. She believed that their love, which had survived so many years, could survive this too. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.